For 6 years my family talked around me at every holiday table like I was furniture, until the Thanksgiving I casually mentioned the one thing that made every fork stop midair, every conversation die, and every person in that dining room finally look at me like they were seeing me for the very first time. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. My family ignored me for years. At Thanksgiving, I casually mentioned, "Let me tell you something about being invisible." Not the dramatic kind of invisible. Not the kind where people actively exclude you or say cruel things to your face or make a deliberate show of shutting you out. That kind, at least, has the dignity of intention. At least someone thought about you long enough to decide against you. I'm talking about the other kind. The quiet kind. The kind where you are physically present at every family gathering, seated at the same table, eating the same food, breathing the same air, and somehow, inexplicably, you are not quite there. Where conversations flow around you like water around a stone, not hostile, just redirected. Where your name is used occasionally, in passing, the way people mention weather or traffic. Functionally. Without weight. That was me. For the better part of 6 years. My name is Donald Marsh. I'm 43 years old. I live in a mid-sized house on a quiet street in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where people rake their leaves on Saturday mornings and wave at each other from driveways, and the biggest annual drama is who puts their Christmas lights up before Thanksgiving. I work as a civil engineer for a firm downtown. I coach my son's soccer team on Wednesday evenings. I make a decent pot of chili. I am, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly solid and unremarkable man living a perfectly solid and unremarkable life. And for 6 years that ordinariness made me essentially invisible to the people who were supposed to know me best. Let me explain how that happens, because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way most slow disasters do. Incrementally, reasonably, with each individual step making just enough sense that you don't notice the direction you're traveling until you're already somewhere you never intended to be. My family, my parents, my older brother Greg and his wife Tanya, my younger sister Melissa and her husband Patrick, are not bad people. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. They are not cruel. They are not malicious. They are just oriented toward a frequency I never quite broadcast on. Greg is loud and funny and takes up space the way certain people do naturally, like it's their birthright. He played college football. He sells commercial real estate now and he is very good at it. He has opinions about everything and delivers them with the confidence of a man who has never seriously considered that he might be wrong. People gravitate toward him at parties. They always have. Melissa is the baby of the family and was treated accordingly for so long that it calcified into permanent identity. She is charming and a little dramatic and very good at making herself the emotional center of any room she walks into. She got married at 26 to Patrick, who is exactly the kind of man a woman like Melissa marries. Handsome, agreeable, completely comfortable existing in her orbit. My parents, Frank and Beverly Marsh, are in their early 70s now. Good people. Church-going, community-minded, the kind of parents who showed up to things and meant well and loved their children in the particular limited vocabulary of their generation, through presence and provision rather than emotional attunement. And then there was me. Middle child. Quiet. More interested in how bridges worked than in football statistics or social maneuvering. I married my college girlfriend, Claire, when I was 27. We had our son James, the single best thing that has ever happened to me without competition, when I was 29. Claire and I divorced when James was 4, quietly and without drama, the way two people separate when they realize they have grown into strangers who share a mortgage and a child but nothing essential anymore. We co-parent well. James spends every other week with each of us and he is, at 13, a remarkably well-adjusted kid who has somehow inherited neither my quietness nor his mother's restlessness but forged his own third thing entirely. After the divorce, the invisibility accelerated. I think what happened, and I've had enough therapy to say this without bitterness, is that I had never been the loudest presence in any room, and without a wife to perform the social labor of keeping me legible to my own family, I simply faded. Greg's kids played travel sports and generated constant drama and content. Melissa's life was a continuous soap opera of renovations and career pivots and social events that required full family attention. My parents aged into the particular self-focus of people managing their own health and mortality. James and I just lived. Quietly. Well, without generating much noise. At Christmas, I sat at the end of the table and answered questions when asked and volunteered nothing that wasn't solicited. At Thanksgiving, I helped with the dishes and watched football with Greg and said the right things at the right times. At family birthday parties, I showed up and stayed the appropriate amount of time and drove home through the dark Ohio streets feeling a specific hollowness that I had gotten so accustomed to I had almost stopped identifying it as anything worth addressing. Almost. James noticed, of course. Kids always notice the things adults have learned to perform normalcy around. One night about a year ago, driving home from a cousin's birthday party, he said from the passenger seat without looking up from his phone, "Dad, does it bother you how they kind of just don't really talk to you?" I kept my eyes on the road. "I'm fine, buddy," I said. He looked up then. Gave me the look that 13-year-olds give you when they have decided you are lying but have chosen, generously, not to press it. "Okay," he said, and went back to his phone. I drove the rest of the way home in the specific silence of a man who has just been seen more clearly by his teenage son than by anyone else in his life. And I thought about the thing I hadn't told my family yet. The thing I had been carrying quietly for 8 months. The thing that was going to come out eventually. And that Thanksgiving, sitting in my parents' Columbus house with the turkey on the table and Greg already holding court about something loud and inconsequential, I had decided was coming out today. Not dramatically. Not as an announcement. Not with any of the performance my family so naturally defaulted to. Just casually. The way I did everything. Before we go any further, have you ever felt invisible to the people who were supposed to know you best? Not because of anything dramatic, just overlooked. Tell me in the comments. Because what Donald says next at that Thanksgiving table changes everything. And I mean everything. Thanksgiving at my parents' house followed the same script it had followed for 20 years. My mother started cooking at 7 in the morning and refused all help until exactly 11, at which point she allowed supervised assistance with specific tasks she had already completed mentally. My father sat in his recliner watching the pregame show with the volume 3 notches higher than necessary. Greg arrived first, always, because arriving first was a form of winning he had never outgrown. He came through the door filling it completely, Tanya behind him, their 3 kids cascading in with the controlled chaos of children who had been in a car too long. Melissa and Patrick arrived 20 minutes later, Melissa carrying a pie she had bought from a bakery and would later accept credit for baking. James and I arrived exactly on time, which in this family meant we were effectively invisible for the first 40 minutes while the louder arrivals completed their entrance rituals. I helped my mother with the green beans. I talked soccer with my nephew Tyler. I stood in the kitchen doorway with a glass of iced tea and watched my family perform itself and felt the familiar, almost comfortable weight of my own transparency. Dinner was called at 2 o'clock. We arranged ourselves around the table in the configuration that had calcified over decades. My parents at the heads, Greg and Tanya on one side with their kids, Melissa and Patrick across from them, James beside me at the far end. The geographical edges of the table. Right where we always ended up. Grace was said. Food was passed. Greg immediately launched into a story about a commercial property deal that had apparently been both dramatic and enormously profitable, and the table oriented toward him the way it always did. My mother asking follow-up questions, my father nodding with the particular pride he reserved for Greg's financial victories, Tanya laughing at the right moments. James caught my eye across his plate of turkey. His expression said, "See what I mean?" I gave him the slight nod that meant, "I see it." The conversation moved through its familiar territories. Melissa's kitchen renovation. Patrick's promotion. The grandchildren's school performances. My mother's book club. My father's knee. At some point my mother turned to me with the bright, slightly effortful smile she used when she remembered I was there and said, "Donald, how's work?" "Good," I said. "Busy." "That's wonderful," she said and turned back to Melissa. James looked at his plate. I took a sip of iced tea. And then, not dramatically, not with any build-up or throat-clearing or bid for attention, I set my glass down and said, in the same conversational tone I might use to mention road construction on the I-71, "Oh, I should probably mention. I'm getting married in the spring." The table didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a power outage moves through a building, section by section, each conversation flickering out as the words reached it, until the whole room was running on nothing. Greg stopped mid-sentence. His fork hovered. Melissa turned from her conversation with Tanya so fast her earring swayed. My mother's hand stopped moving over the stuffing bowl. My father looked up from his plate with an expression I genuinely could not remember seeing on his face before. Pure, unperformed surprise. James, beside me, was looking at his turkey with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had known this was coming and had been waiting to see how the room would handle it. "I'm sorry," Greg said, which was not a sentence Greg used often. "You're what?" "Getting married," I said. "In April. Her name is Nora." "Nora," my mother repeated, as if testing whether the word was real. "How long?" Melissa started. 8 months, I said. 8 months, Greg said. "You've been with someone for 8 months and this is the first we're." "I mentioned I was dating someone in March," I said pleasantly. "At Easter. You were telling a story about the Henderson account. It wasn't a good moment." Complete silence. James took a bite of turkey. Chewed. Swallowed. Said nothing. But I could see the corner of his mouth doing something that was not quite a smile. "Donald," my mother said, in the tone she used when she was recalibrating. "Tell us about her." So I did. Her full name was Nora Callahan. 41 years old. She taught high school English literature in Westerville, the suburb just north of Columbus where she had grown up and, after a decade in Chicago, returned to 3 years ago following the end of a long engagement that she described, when she eventually told me about it, with the dry precision of someone who had done significant work processing it. He was a good man who wanted a specific kind of life, and I was a good woman who wanted a different one, and we waited 4 years too long to admit that to each other. She had dark red hair that she wore differently every time I saw her. Sometimes down, sometimes pulled back in ways that looked accidental but probably weren't. She had green eyes and a habit of going completely still when she was thinking, like all her energy consolidated inward. She laughed easily and argued thoughtfully and had strong opinions about books that she delivered without apology and revised without embarrassment when presented with a convincing counterargument. She had walked into my life in the most undramatic way possible. Through a parent-teacher conference. James was in her English class. He had written an essay about a novel she had assigned that apparently impressed her enough to request a conference, not because anything was wrong, but because, as she put it when I sat down across from her in her classroom after school on a Wednesday in March, "I wanted to meet the parent of a kid who writes like this. He has something real. I thought you should know." I had looked at her across the small desk in that classroom with its posters and its stacks of essays and its particular smell of old books and whiteboard markers, and I had thought, completely without planning to, "This woman is the most interesting person I've sat across from in years." We talked about James for 20 minutes and then, almost without noticing the transition, about the novel he had written about, and then about 3 other novels, and then about a restaurant near the school that she recommended. And then it was 5:40 and the custodian was vacuuming the hallway outside and we were both still sitting there. I asked her to dinner the following Friday. She said yes before I finished the sentence. Back at the Thanksgiving table, I watched my family process this information in real time. The recalibration was visible. The slight shame of people realizing they had missed something significant while they were busy looking elsewhere. "We want to meet her," my mother said finally, with a warmth that was genuine and slightly desperate simultaneously. "You will," I said. "She's having dinner with us next Sunday." I told her you'd all be there. Another silence. Smaller this time. The kind that contained rearranged schedules and unspoken acknowledgments. "You already planned it," Melissa said. "Yes," I said. Greg looked at me with an expression I had not seen him direct at me since we were children. Something close to respect, recalibrated through surprise. "Donald," he said, "when did you get?" "I was always like this," I said pleasantly. "You were busy." James, beside me, took a long drink of water and said absolutely nothing. But his eyes were bright. The following Sunday, my parents' house had a different energy entirely. My mother had cooked for 2 days. My father had vacuumed the living room, something I could not recall witnessing in my lifetime. Greg and Tanya arrived early, which never happened. Melissa had changed outfits twice before arriving, according to a text she sent me that morning that said, "What does Nora like? Casual or dressy? I don't want to seem like I'm trying too hard." I texted back, "She teaches high school English, Melissa. She grades papers in a flannel shirt. Just be normal." A pause. Then, "I don't know what that means for me specifically." Nora arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and the particular ease of a woman who is comfortable in rooms full of strangers because she has spent her career managing rooms full of teenagers, which is considerably harder. She shook my father's hand and asked him a question about a model ship on his bookshelf that turned out to be from a Navy vessel he'd served on briefly in his 20s, a detail I had known in the abstract but never asked about. And within 4 minutes my father was talking about something he almost never talked about while Nora listened with the complete, unhurried attention she gave everything. James gravitated to her immediately, because of course he did. They had an ongoing conversation about a book he was reading for her class that resumed mid-thread as if the parent-teacher conference had never ended. Greg attempted, at one point, to dominate the conversation with a story. Nora let him finish, asked one precise follow-up question that reframed the entire story in a way that made Greg look slightly uncertain, and then gracefully redirected the conversation to Tanya, who had been trying to get a word in for several minutes. I watched all of this from the kitchen doorway with a glass of wine and felt something I want to try to describe accurately. It wasn't triumph. It was more like recognition. The feeling of watching someone be exactly who you knew they were in front of people who were only now figuring it out. "She's extraordinary," my mother said, appearing beside me in the doorway, her voice quiet and sincere. "I know," I said. A pause. "Donald," she started. "It's okay, Mom," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet in the way that certain mothers' eyes get when they realize something about their children that perhaps they should have realized sooner. "Is it?" she asked. I looked at Nora across the living room, laughing at something James had just said, her red hair catching the lamplight, completely at home in a room she had never been in before. "It's going to be," I said. "Here's what I want to ask you. Has someone ever walked into your family and immediately made everyone realize what had been missing? Drop it in the comments. Because what happens between Donald and Nora next is the part of this story I almost didn't survive telling. 3 weeks after the Sunday dinner, Nora and I were sitting on my back porch on a cold December night with blankets and coffee, the kind of evening that arrives naturally after 8 months with someone. Unhurried, no agenda, just the easy occupation of shared space. She had been quieter than usual all evening. Not withdrawn. Nora was never withdrawn, but interior. Processing something. "Can I tell you something I haven't told you yet?" she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at her coffee cup. "The engagement I told you about. The one that ended." "Ryan," I said. She had mentioned his name once. "We were together for 4 years," she said. "And for about 2 of those years I knew. I knew in the way you know things you're not ready to know yet that it wasn't right. That we wanted different things. But I stayed because leaving felt like failure and because I was 36 and because everyone around me was treating the relationship like a conclusion they'd already reached and I didn't want to reopen it." "What finally ended it?" I asked. "I did," she said. 6 months before the wedding. I called it off." A pause. "His family it was not graceful. My own family didn't fully understand. I spent about a year feeling like I had burned my life down for no reason anyone around me could see." "But you could see it," I said. "I could see it," she said. "That's the part that was loneliest. Knowing something clearly that nobody else around you can see yet." I was quiet for a moment. "I know something about that," I said. She looked at me. "Being the person in the room that nobody quite registers," I said. "You know you're there. You know you have something worth saying. But the frequency just doesn't." I stopped. "Doesn't land," she said quietly. "Doesn't land," I agreed. We sat with that for a moment. The cold December air around us and the warm coffee between our hands and the specific intimacy of two people who have just confirmed something they had suspected about each other for months. James told me, she said carefully. In class, in an essay. Not directly, but kids write what they live. He wrote about a man who builds things quietly while everyone around him looks at the sky. I read it and I thought. She stopped. What? I asked. I thought, I hope that man knows what he has, she said. I hope someone has told him. I set my coffee down. Nora, I said. I know, she said. I'm telling you now. I reached across the blanket and took her hand, and she leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat on that cold porch in Columbus, Ohio in December and said nothing else for a long time because nothing else was necessary. January arrived with the particular gray persistence of Ohio winters and with it, unexpectedly, friction. It came from Melissa. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could tell from the first 3 seconds of the call, the slight overbrightness in her voice, the careful pacing, that she had rehearsed this. I just want to make sure you've thought this through, she said. April is very fast. Donald. You've known her 8 months. 9 now, I said. 9 months. And James is at a sensitive age. James adores her, I said. They have a standing book argument every Thursday. I just think, she paused. I talked to Mom. We both think maybe you're moving fast because you've been, I don't know how to say this, lonely. For a while. And Nora is wonderful, she really is, but... Melissa, I said. We just want to make sure you're thinking clearly and not just... Melissa. She stopped. I need you to hear me say something, I said carefully. I have been thinking clearly for 9 months. I thought clearly through 8 years of being an afterthought at every family dinner. I thought clearly through a divorce and single parenthood and a career I built without anybody in this family ever asking what I was working on. I have been thinking clearly my entire adult life. I don't need you and Mom to check my thinking now. Silence. That's not fair, she said quietly. We always. I know you didn't mean it, I said. That's almost the harder part. I heard her exhale. I'm not asking for your blessing, Melissa, I said. I'm telling you about my life. Those are different things. I ended the call with my hands completely steady and sat at my kitchen table in the quiet of my house and breathed. James appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the supernatural teenager ability to materialize at emotionally significant moments. Aunt Melissa, he said. Yeah, I said. He nodded slowly. Considered. She means well, he said. I know, I said. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. He poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter. Are you going to tell Nora? He asked. Yes, I said. Good, he said. She should know what she's walking into. 13 years old. Absolutely remarkable. I told Nora about the call the following evening. She listened without interrupting. The complete, still attention she gave everything. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. How did it make you feel? She asked. Not therapist quiet. Just genuinely asking. Honestly. I said. Tired. The specific tired of explaining your own life to people who should already understand it. She nodded. Can I tell you what I think? She said. Always, I said. I think your family loves you in the only vocabulary they have, she said. And I think that vocabulary is limited and sometimes it comes out wrong and sometimes it causes real damage. Both of those things are true simultaneously. That's generous, I said. It's accurate, she said. Generous would be pretending the damage isn't real. A pause. The damage is real, Donald. What you described, years of being the person nobody quite sees, that's real. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. But, I said. No but, she said. Just and. It's real, and your family is also capable of more than they've shown you. And I think the Thanksgiving moment proved that. I think they're recalibrating. People can recalibrate. You sound very sure of that, I said. I recalibrated, she said simply. I was so afraid of being alone that I almost married the wrong person to avoid it. Then I spent a year being actually alone and figured out the difference. She looked at me steadily. The difference is whether the person beside you makes you feel more like yourself or less. I looked at her across the table. More, I said. Significantly more. Same, she said. I reached across the table. She took my hand. I'm going to call Melissa back, I said. And I'm going to invite her and Patrick to dinner. With you. Nora raised an eyebrow. Brave. Necessary, I said. She needs to know who she was actually talking about when she called. Nora smiled. The real one, the one that reached her eyes completely. I'll bring wine, she said. The dinner happened on a Saturday in February. Melissa arrived with Patrick and the careful brightness of someone who had also been doing some thinking since a difficult phone call. She hugged me at the door with more pressure than usual. She hugged Nora with the specific warmth of a woman attempting a genuine reset. The evening was not without its awkward passages. Melissa had a tendency to over-explain herself when she was nervous, and she was nervous for approximately the first 40 minutes. Patrick, to his credit, was simply himself, easy and warm, and that helped. What shifted it was a moment about an hour in when James, who had joined us for dinner, made an observation about a book that launched him and Nora into one of their running arguments, and Melissa watched the two of them, this woman and her brother's teenage son, debating literature with the ease of people who had been doing it for years, and something in her face changed. She leaned over to me quietly while the argument continued. He lights up around her, she said. He does, I said. Donald, she said. Stopped. Started again. I was wrong to call the way I called. I was projecting my own. I was worried about you in a way that came out as control, and that wasn't fair. I know, I said. I also think, she said carefully, that I wasn't used to you needing anything. You were always just there. Solid. And I think I took that to mean you were fine. That you didn't need us to see me, I said quietly. She looked at me with her eyes bright. I'm sorry, she said. I'm really sorry, Donald. I put my arm around my sister briefly, the way we had when we were children, before the family sorted itself into its various configurations and we all learned our assigned roles. Recalibrate, I said. She laughed, surprised out of her emotion by the word. What? Something Nora said, I said. People can recalibrate. Across the table Nora caught my eye, raised her wine glass almost imperceptibly. I raised mine back. We got married on a Saturday in April. Not a large wedding. 40 people in a restored barn venue outside Columbus, with string lights and wildflowers and a playlist James had spent 3 weeks curating with a seriousness of purpose he usually reserved for soccer tactics. My parents in the front row. My father in his best suit. My mother with a handkerchief she had brought preemptively and used within the first 5 minutes. Greg gave a toast that was, to my genuine surprise, not primarily about Greg. He talked about the kind of man I had always been, quiet, precise, the one who fixed things without announcement, who showed up without being asked, who built things that lasted. He said he was sorry it took him this long to say it out loud. His voice cracked once. He covered it with a joke. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say, and I believed every word. Melissa cried from the ceremony through the cocktail hour and apologized to Nora 3 separate times for the January phone call. Nora accepted each apology with the same graceful directness she brought to everything, and by the third one told Melissa firmly that it was handled and she was family and that was the end of it, which made Melissa cry harder. James stood beside me as my best man, his idea delivered 3 months earlier with characteristic economy. I want to stand up there with you. If that's okay. It was more than okay. It was everything. When the officiant asked if I took Nora to be my wife, I looked at her. Standing there in a simple ivory dress, red hair down, green eyes clear and present and looking at me with the full, undistracted attention she gave everything, and I said I do with the full understanding of what those 2 words contained. Every quiet year. Every overlooked dinner. Every midnight thought about whether any of this was ever going to add up to something. It had added up to this. She said it back the same way, like she meant the whole thing, not just the ceremony. After the reception, late, when most of the guests had gone and James was asleep in the back of my parents' car waiting to be driven home, Nora and I stood alone for a moment in the emptying barn. String lights still on. Wildflowers on the tables. The pleasant wreckage of a good party around us. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Like I said something at Thanksgiving," I said. And someone finally heard it. She laughed. The real one. Took both my hands. "Donald," she said, "I have been hearing you since March." "I know," I said. "That's why I married you in April." We walked out of the barn into the Ohio spring night, cool and clear and smelling like new grass and possibility, and behind us the string lights burned warm and steady. And for the first time in longer than I could calculate, I was not the least visible person in my own story. Here is my final question, and I mean this genuinely. Is there someone in your life who has been quietly showing up, quietly building, quietly being extraordinary, and maybe you haven't told them you see it yet? Go tell them. Drop a comment below if this story hit home. Because Donald was always there. He just needed one person to finally look. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.